Future Design Podcast.
Yeah, having a currency hegemony against others, I also agree that it doesn't really make sense because everybody is going to be reliant on the U.S. monetary policies, whether what they're going to do, how they're going to deflate it, how they're going to inflate it, and everybody has to think about the exchanges all the time. So if you have a different monetary base or a different currency that the people can base it on, and it's very dependent on how they run their own country or their monetary system, then I think it creates a lot more stability and also financial discipline in each of those countries because they're reliant on comparison between that base currency that they've internationally created. But in terms of like the use of cryptocurrency in our kind of everyday lives, to me, you talked about the central bank digital currency, which I think is completely scary as hell because like a country like which one you said is that they can have completely control over your financial freedom. They can take away money if they want to because they don't like that you jaywalked or you watch some porn site or whatever it is. And at the same time, we have the decentralized cryptocurrencies that are based on completely free, unpolitical bias currencies that has nothing to do with monetary policies, which I think which is an amazing creation that we can all use or even for me, and nowadays it seems like crypto or Bitcoin in particular is all about preserving wealth. It's not about spending it. It's not e-cash that that it began with. It was more about people comparing that with gold and using that as a preservation of wealth. And there could be other cryptocurrency that will come out of this whole industry. But I think that the use of cryptocurrency is also very interesting because it's not really tied to anything, and we're all going to be free from any political and monetary disasters that potentially countries can create. But in terms of like the market adoption of cryptocurrency, still is very, very infant in its infant stage. And I've talked to a couple of people who are doing like meetups and trying to promote cryptocurrencies in the world. But there's always been this kind of idea that it's shady. There's a lot of black money going through that system. So what do you think it would take for actually a cryptocurrency to be well adopted in this market?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's sometimes the connotations that people associate with Bitcoin or initially, right? It's like, well, it's used by gangsters, and there was the Silk Road site, and there was porn there, and et cetera. And one of the things I tell people is that currencies like the dollar are also used for for similar purpose. I mean, and it's true. And originally I'm from the country of Panama. I'm an immigrant to the United States. Well, I don't know if you ever heard of the Panama Papers.
Of course.
And so so to single out Bitcoin as some sort of a safe harbor, for criminality. I mean, be careful where you throw those stones because they can easily be pointed back. But in answer to your question, I wrote a couple articles in 2017 about Bitcoin because I was concerned about the speculative fervor that was being attached to it, and it really was commensurate with what I saw in that omni bubble thing that we were talking about earlier. But one of the things I think, or maybe the central thing that I think will help the adoption, and you're obviously working in the industry, is to create a user interface, for the average person that is very, very easy to use. And whether that's, the person that on the retail end, not just from the owner of a business, but even the consumer, right? Right now, I mean, if you think about what it takes to actually conduct a Bitcoin transaction to purchase something, if you have a hardware wallet, again, I don't know that, that if I just go to one of my neighbors and say, hey, here's a hardware wallet, I'm going to put some Bitcoin on it, they go ahead and spend it on, Takatoshi's website where he's selling something, right? I mean, that's not a slam dunk, right? It is a slam dunk for me to go to Takatoshi's website and pull my credit card out. I put my number in, expiration date, and my CVC, and I can make that transaction. We're not there yet, right? So we need to get to the point where user interfaces, hardware wallets, all of those things are much, much easier to use, right? I agree with you 100%. Right now, Bitcoin is serving as a potential store of value for people that are obviously understandably nervous about what's going on in the world financial system. And it's probably not used transactionally. I mean, I don't know if you have. I've used Bitcoin very, very few times from a transactional perspective where I'm, buying something, right? I've never earned a Bitcoin, as an author or, a consultant or what have you. I've got a site that that I put my books on that people can, pay me in Bitcoin or even Ethereum or Litecoin, I think, as well. But those sites, they don't necessarily get that much traction. In fact, they don't really get any traction at all. So the acceleration, the adoption has to be through the creation of a user interface. We got to make it easier for people to use. And the one thing that and it's interesting because my career was spent a lot in telecommunications technology, networking related technologies, and it's really interesting to see the parallel between how the internet grew, because I got involved in what I'll call the early stages of the internet in the mid 90s. And what's happened with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, it's very, very similar in the standpoint, I tell people that the internet is a beautiful thing because it's decentralized. Nobody runs it, right? Now governments can try to circumvent some of the architecture that's there, right? And in certain countries, you can't access certain websites. We know that. But organically, the internet is decentralized. It's permissionless, right? Anybody can connect to it. It's decentralized. I don't care how my transmission right now, who I'm connecting to get all the way to Singapore, right? And Bitcoin really has a lot of those same qualities about it. So we know that architecturally, the internet has been incredibly successful, right? And there's no reason why Bitcoin can't be the same thing, because Bitcoin essentially is money for the internet, right? It's that medium of exchange, that transaction mechanism that's really optimized for the internet. And again, it's not necessarily the purview of Bitcoin. There can be other, cryptocurrencies that can function just as well, I'm sure, in the future, right? But until we get to the point where, maybe I can hand my neighbor or my mom, like, hey, here, mom, go buy this. And, I give her something, maybe some sort of easy user interface on a computer. We're not there yet, right? For it to be, again, that transactional mechanism, because eventually, that's what Satoshi Nakamoto's vision was, right? We wanted to make this a medium of exchange, right? And to really act as money. And that's really what it is. It's not there yet, but it's definitely gotten a lot of attention because it is a store of value. There's a limited supply, et cetera, et cetera.
And a lot of people, when they talk about Bitcoin and well, they were advocating Bitcoin, they're coming out from a more libertarian or Austrian economics school of thought. And you talked quite a lot about reducing the government's role in society, whether in the financial system or in a more bureaucratic system as well. I mean, are you also like an advocate for a more libertarian society?
Well, in the United States, when the United States was born as a country, my country, I'm from Panama originally. My country was born in 1914, right? It gained its independence. Singapore, 1965, I believe, right? Getting independence from the United Kingdom. So Singapore is a very young country. Panama is a pretty young country. United States born 1776. And when the country was architected, in the book that you see behind me, I create a political spectrum, so to speak, where on one side you have anarchy, nobody's in charge of anything. And the other side you have, what I'll call the isms, communism, fascism, socialism, where you have a much greater government participation in the economy and really in people's lives. When we first started this country, we were much closer to that anarchic, part of the spectrum. We weren't anarchic, obviously, but there was a lot more, to use the word liberal today means something completely different than when, in the late 1700s, United States, Europe and so forth. And it strikes me that, over the course of time, at least in the United States, we've drifted over towards those isms that we talked about. And that happens for two reasons. One, we live in a representative democracy, so our representatives are supposed to represent our views. If we ask for more, they're going to try to give us more. And we don't have any financial friction that prevents that from happening, right? Well, if we run a budget deficit, who cares, right? The government spends more money, there's a willing cadre of buyers there that will buy our debt. And if they don't buy it, well, then by golly, the central bank of the United States may buy it, or maybe the Bank of Japan, maybe, the Bank of Switzerland, whoever it is, right? The central banking organization, the organism of central banking can suck all that extra liquidity up, right? And so there's no friction to any of that. So what happens is I've created a phrase, I call it, freedom of versus freedom from. Do you know the difference? And we've slowly, over time, we've asked for more of those freedoms from something. I want to make sure that I'm free from, from indigency in old age. I don't want to be poor. I want to be free from ill health. In the United States, we have an incredibly complicated tax code that is just incredibly large. And really, that's an instrument of people that want to use the government for some personal benefit, for a company, corporation, organization, what have you. And when you do that, you create larger government. And I'm not saying that larger government is wrong per se, but when you have larger government, it creates more complicated, it makes life much more complicated. It centralizes things more. And then you run into more of that. You were talking about it earlier about, people want, their part of the pie, right? And if they don't have a powerful lobbyist in Washington, D.C. or any other, national capital, there's nobody necessarily speaking for them, financially. And that's the problem that you've had is that, we've had so much largesse, but it hasn't gone, uniformly across the spectrum. And then you end up with social problems, wealth inequality, income inequality. So, yeah, I mean, that's something that, and we're starting to see that kind of come to a head more, especially in the United States, when you see a lot more protests. But you see them in France as well, right? You see the green vests in France, Hong Kong, little bit different manifestation, but society is very, very restless right now, right? Very, very restless. And it's hard to have healthy economies when you have restless societies, right? And the people that are restless, will manifest that in different ways. You see the rise of nationalism in different countries, and you talked about that earlier. It's very difficult, I think, to all of a sudden say, well, we're going to decouple all countries from world trade, right? Eventually that's not efficient. But what's happening right now is people are saying, well, our supply chains are inextricably tied to China. And, we're having political issues with China, so maybe we shouldn't have our supply chains there. And we've had this pandemic. And so one of the things that I write about is that, during certain times, you have feelings of cooperation, of happiness, and you'll see that expressed through treaties, the European Union, right? That happened at a certain point in time. Well, what's happened in the European Union here most recently? You had Brexit, right? You've had other companies. And so you have this kind of fracturing that's going on, right? And I think I know you're going to see more and more of that. You're going to see more countries, retrenching. But at the end of that crisis, and again, however long it takes, you'll see everything come back together again. But there has to be something to bring it back together, right? And there has to be some sense, my opinion, of financial and economic equality for that to occur, right? In order to kind of bring back those good feelings again.
It seems like we're pretty much in a very difficult spot where, there's no real move from any of the government to decide what they want to do. I mean, one side is going very nationalist and the other side saying, oh, we've got to be more liberal and accepting of all different cultures and sizes of economy, and we have to bring it all together. So, it just seems like, we're kind of like already in a tangled nut already. And not necessarily finding a solution for it. Whether you enlarge governments, you make it smaller, it doesn't seem to really fix the problem. And as you said, people are looking for freedom from, which means that people over the years since the founding of the U.S. seems like people are looking for the government to do more stuff for them, and they're just slowly giving away their liberty. And now people want not equality of opportunities, but they want equal results, and that leads to more enlarged governments. And so, in our mindset, I mean, is it that we have to start thinking about how could we be more independent from governments? How can we be more independent from all the catastrophes that are happening and try to save ourselves in some way that we can be financially free, we can be politically free? Or is it some other idea that you can come up with?
I think that's my answer, right? I think eventually you have to move for that, because if you think about, if there's this big piece of pie, right, and there's only some people that can dip their fork into that pie and take some of that pie, but some people are restricted from going into that pie. It creates a lot of feelings of resentment, right? And so the issue is, how do we get more people to kind of bake their own pies, right? And that comes, I think, through individual liberty, individual freedom. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that right there is the central theme of my fictional series. Is that you see this, and it's set just a few years into the future, where you see this tug between authoritarianism and liberty, and people that want that authoritarian, right? I mean, there's people in certainly the United States, and I'm sure other parts of the world as well. They want the authority because they want to have some sense that there's some entity there, and the only entity that can do that is a central government, right? I want them to be able to do the following things for me. Okay, well, when that happens, it costs to do that, right? Because government doesn't exist on its own, right? And not only costs to do that, but you also are giving something up. And I think that's one thing that is lost, I think, in a lot of analyses, is that the more you ask them to do, the more freedom you have to give up, on your own. And the more freedom that you give up, then that means that you're going to be subject to potentially, an arbitrary set of rules that, may disadvantage you one time. Maybe the next time it creates advantages for you, right? Maybe 9 out of 10 times it disadvantages you because some segment of the population has spoken more vociferously about, some benefit that they want. And that's something that's really, really missing in a lot of these analyses, is that nobody really thinks about that. And that's something I've spent, as you can tell, some time kind of thinking about that. And if you want to solve some of these problems, I mean, that's what you have to get to, I think. Getting to that point is going to be very difficult, right? And as I mentioned earlier, I really believe that we will have to pass through a crisis. I'm not talking about COVID right now. I'm talking about something, grander, a monetary type crisis to kind of create that awakening. Now, what happens on the other side of that? I mean, I don't know, right? I don't have the crystal ball. No, my vision would be to see, something where, people can express their own freedom and liberty. You still absolutely, I mean, there's a lot of people that, that call themselves libertarian, and they don't want to see any form of government whatsoever. I mean, there's some, I won't mention any names. There's a couple of people that are wealthy investors, and they're very, very libertarian. I mean, they see no use for government whatsoever. Everything can be privatized. I don't believe that, and the reason I don't believe that is because, in many governments, in the United States, particularly for many, many years, maybe a century, you could say that it worked very well having a central government. It wasn't as powerful as it is right now, tax burdens were a lot less, right? There was less expected of the government. But my gosh, the country grew substantially well. And again, the country where you're residing now, I mean, that's got to be a seminal example of, how to grow a country into an international powerhouse. I mean, a country that's, 300 square miles. I mean, that's like a metropolitan area, in many cities in the United States. I mean, and yet you have, this flourishing economy. Now, maybe everyone doesn't agree with, the model of government that the way Singapore has, but it has to be used as an example of how an economy can flourish, can go from zero to here, right? Very, very, quick, in within a generation, basically, right? Or generation and a half. But unfortunately, I think we have to pass through crises. I mean, that's what's historically shown, that, you pass through these crises, to use a term from an author that I read, Neil Howe, you go through this turning, right? You go through this, what's called a fourth turning. And so you kind of turn society over, and you have different people in that society that have lived through certain things. They know how to, carry the society into that next, turn. We've had that before. And I believe in cycles. We're going to go through another cycle. There'll be something better on the other side of it. I'm a very big believer in technology solving a lot of problems that, some of the problems that we're talking about today, right, potentially can be solved technologically in the future. I mean, nanotechnology has unbelievable, right, capability, potential to it. I'm very, very hopeful about blockchains. I'm hopeful about, the monetary capability of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, biotech. There's a lot of things that are there, right? But we're not going to get there like, linearly, right? You may see a little bit of a, kind of a upward sine wave, on the way there.
Yeah, I read a book from Jeremy Rifkin about zero marginal economy, or zero marginal cost, where because of all these technological improvements, then a lot of the costs for things, production value, or even the goods and services that you can get is going to be near zero. So then technology is going to solve itself, the inequalities of life, because you don't have to spend that much for anything anymore, and then the governments can slowly just step away from governing the whole economy. And that's the kind of utopia, I guess, that they was talking about. But definitely,
well, it's something called time prices too. It's like, if you think about, like, 50 years ago, how many hours would it take of labor for an average worker to buy a television, as an example, right? And if you compare that, 50 years ago, 1970 to 2020, well, I mean, it takes a fraction of the amount of time, right? So to your point, that's what technology can do. It can reduce that time price, value.
Yeah. I guess we could talk over and over about this stuff. I really enjoy talking to you, Jim. So, we definitely want to know more about you. And could you tell us your upcoming book and all the other books that you've written? Because, it does give us a glimpse of what the future might look like.
Yeah, the book behind me right now, Escaping Oz: An Observer's Reflections, that's the third in a nonfiction series. They all have the title Escaping Oz and then a different subtitle. Again, those are nonfiction. It kind of takes you through a little bit of monetary, not this book, but the previous ones kind of take you a little bit of monetary history, what the next economic downturn will look like, which we're kind of seeing right now, maybe what financial assets to avoid, what safe things to do. This book behind me kind of talks a little bit more about that freedom of and freedom from, and what happens when you ask government to do too much. What are some of the consequences of it? Politically, economically, socially, and so forth. I'm really excited about my fictional series. It's 4 books now. It uses a journalist as the protagonist. The first book is called 2020, and it's based on the U.S. presidential election of this year, 2020. And there's something that occurs in that book, a bombshell event that then sets the stage for the remaining 3 books in the series, something that the president does. And what you'll see in that series is you'll see it's a thriller series that encompasses politics, financial crisis, cyber terror, some kinetic terror, secession movements, cryptocurrencies are involved. Little love story, right? You got to kind of make it entertaining. You got to put a little love story in there. And there's mentorship. There are cyber characters that appear primarily, in cyberspace, because that's kind of like the next battlefield, if you will, potentially. In the United States, anyway, and this is something that it kind of blows my mind. Some of these things that I've written about have kind of like come to fruition. I think you're going to see more of an impact of domestic national security on, maintaining law and order. Like in the United States, you've seen right now, we've had, protests against police forces, and, now you see policemen retiring, quitting, et cetera. So it leaves that gap there. And so one of my visions for the fictional series is that you'll see now the federal government then respond, say, okay, we need to maintain law and order. So here's how we're going to do that. And, in the United States, you have a law that prohibits the U.S. military, from being involved in local policing, only under very, very specific conditions. So, my thought is, okay, well, here's what's going to happen is you're going to militarize some segments of the federal government that are not, the military, right? So they'll have this, great capability. You'll see a lot of more spying and surveillance. You'll see that, within the context of my books too. So I think it's a series from, the reaction that I got from readers on my fictional series is that it makes them really think about what's going on right now. 1 or 2 of the books scare the hell out of them, because of, some of the things that happen. And I tell people, if you're kind of scared and you're kind of bothered by some of the things that you read about, then, mission accomplished, because I do want to kind of create that awareness of, what could happen potentially.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jim, and hopefully we can do another one of these maybe after the COVID situation's over, and then we can re-examine what's going on in the world. Probably not much different, but it'd be interesting to see what your views are in the world after that. So thank
Yeah,
you so much for
absolutely.
your
Yeah,
time.
absolutely. Let's do it again.
Yeah,
Thank you.
awesome. All right, thank you very much.
Hi, this is your host Takatoshi Shibayama. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Now, if you enjoyed or disliked this show, please let me know by writing in the comment section. The only way I can improve or add value to you is through your voices. If there are any topics that you would like me to pick up, please also let me know in the comments. I'd love to start chatting with you all. And if you would like to continue watching the show, please subscribe. Thank you.